आजादी की जंग लड़ने वाले मेरे दोस्तों, आजादी चाहिए तो उसकी कीमत खून दे के चुकानी होगी। तुम मुझे खून दो, मैं तुम्हें आजादी दूंगा।
आईएनए की बागी फौजियों पर अंग्रेज देशद्रोह का मुकदमा चलाएंगे।
उन तीनों के बचने के चांसेस कम हैं।
This trial and its judgment will be remembered throughout history.
I focus primarily on international cartels, and I'll explain that definition later. The use of monetary and penal penalties, that is, putting people in prison, to discourage international price fixing is a phenomenon that's developed in our lifetimes, and I'm including you young students. It's been a recent development, beginning around 1990 or a little thereafter. The questions I hope to address here are, to what extent have penalties increased over the last 26 years, quarter century plus? How severe are those penalties? And what is the evidence that they may be discouraging the formation of cartels or causing the cartels to break up that are already in operation? So that's my purpose today, and what I, in general, will conclude is that the penalties imposed by the major antitrust authorities in the world have indeed exploded over the past quarter century, not only in size, but in the types and in the geographic distribution as well. So there are many dimensions to this increased penalties trend. However, at the same time, paradoxically, the number of new cartels being discovered every year is rising exponentially. Well, how can that be? How can it be getting worse and still providing an environment for new cartels to be formed and discovered every year? It's a paradox, for sure. Moreover, the severity of the penalties, as I will show, is somewhat lower than the rates of overcharges. So that's something that encourages their formation. So this and other evidence tends to suggest that penalties have been inadequate to deter the formation of international cartels, and also too low to dissuade established cartels from breaking up. Here is the numbers of penalties. Now, by penalties, I mean to include both fines and private damages that are paid, which is mostly a North American phenomenon. As you can see, back in the early 1990s, the USA, Canada, and European Commission had the whole business to themselves. I mean, they were the only players in the world fining international cartels. And still, if you look at 2010, 2015, they still comprise almost half of the total, those two geographic areas or jurisdictions. However, the real story here is the growth of the national competition authorities in the EU, something that even people in the EU don't seem to know about, and the growth in the rest of the world. I just used that to comprise Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'll be talking more in detail about the rest of the world. So a large increase totaling 107 billion by the end of 2015 and increasing at an exponential rate. As you can see, this is an exponential curve. It fits perfectly, 0.9997. This is the kind of R-square I dream about at night. So since it's so good a fit, we can make a prediction or projection. If past trends continue, then cumulative penalties will reach $280 billion by 2022. I still hope to be alive at that time and see if my prediction was correct. But check on it for me, would you? Why are cartels' penalties going up? One reason, the number of jurisdictions that are prosecuting international cartels has gone up tremendously. That's a sign of maturity when a antitrust authority takes on an international cartel. Well, again, what's an international cartel? It's a cartel with at least one defendant from outside the jurisdiction, has headquarters outside the jurisdiction. That makes obtaining information, documents, difficult. The individuals involved in managing the cartel may decide to leave the jurisdiction that's suing them and never return, so you can't get witnesses. So evidentiary problems are high in the case of international cartels. That's why, trying the first international case is a big step for a new antitrust authority. Well, we've gone from 4 of them in the early 90s up to over 70, a tremendous increase in authorities who have taken on at least one international cartel. Here's the data on the national competition authorities up to the middle of 2016. And again, you can see a very strong trend. It varies from year to year. But they have imposed $24 billion in fines, which is more than double what the Department of Justice in the United States has imposed in the same period. So those 27 or 28, going down to 27 or 26, I forget what's going to happen when UK leaves, they have been extremely aggressive, I would say, and there are 8 or 10 of them that are particularly so. Rest of the world, also exploding even faster. Africa, Asia, Latin America. Back in the 5 years, 1990-94, the total amount of fines was $3 million. Not much by today's standards. And then it went over $12 billion for the remaining, the last 5 years of this period. So in total, $18 million. They and the European Union's national competition authorities are neck and neck, and we'll see what happens. It's an interesting race. Another reason that explains the increase in penalties is that more and more cartels are being discovered through the use of leniency programs. It's difficult to identify every leniency applicant, but I've done the best I can. And the first leniency program was 1993, introduced by the United States, which gave the leniency applicant 0 fines and protected its executives from going to jail if they would provide sufficient evidence that there was a violation. That model was first adopted by Canada and then by the European Commission a few years later because it worked so well. It's thus the prisoner's dilemma of game theory put into practice. It's a marvelous idea, straight from economics, okay? So we see that the number of amnesties is going up, but also broadening. The total number of amnesties is rising, but the share that the national competition authorities in the EU has gone up. The rest of the world also, especially since 2005. Amnesty applications are now the principal way in which hidden illegal arrangements are discovered. And that has increased the number per year, one of the main reasons. Not only that, but the average size of the fines being imposed has gone up over time. Whether you say fines per decision or fines per company, however you measure it, there are larger fines being imposed by the antitrust authorities around, this is for the entire world, through 2014. Now, the India-South Africa contrast is interesting. India's economy is several times larger than South Africa's, yet the amounts of fines imposed by the two agencies is fairly similar. Why is that? Well, South Africa Competition Commission of South Africa got a good law earlier, well before 2002. They have a good-sized agency. They have a high degree of competence in the judiciary, and they have a lot of economists and legal experts in the country. It's a very mature legal system, and works fairly fast, I would say, compared to what I've heard about India. Okay, so those are some of the differences. A comparison of India and South Africa would be very interesting because in terms of totals, they're very similar. Now, this is how the CCI looks from an outsider like me. Doubtless I've missed a few. Doubtless I've made a couple of mistakes here. I apologize for that in advance, but this is what I've been able to learn about international cartels. Obviously, the number of domestic cartels is many times larger, but I work by myself, and I couldn't possibly follow every cartel. So the international cartels is it's a nice cut for me. The first international cartel I was able to find out about was the soda ash export cartel. The exporters were US companies, by the way, so India was being exploited by Americans. I apologize for that. Look at the third one. Medical supplies in India, World Bank. What? The World Bank is an antitrust authority? You heard it first here, I'm sure. Yes, it is an antitrust authority. It punishes companies that have bid rigged against its programs. And there was a program involving medical supplies in India, not a small one, $350 million was the size of the grant. And 2 or 3, I believe, European companies, pharmaceutical supply companies, colluded against the World Bank to get higher prices. The World Bank found out about it. Now, it cannot impose fines, but it does ban those companies from future bids on the tenders for up to 5 years, I believe. And this happened again with pyrethroid, which is an agricultural chemical, I believe. So it's happened twice that India has been helped by the World Bank, an unexpected detail, I'm sure. There's another extremely interesting case in here, and that's the shipping conference between or within India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Ceylon. Established long time ago, before any of us were born, I can tell you that. It was banned, or there was a consent decree, or an order, if you like, without monetary penalties imposed by the former Monopolies Commission. Now, what's interesting about this cartel, shipping cartel, is that it was 134 years old when it was put out of business. India holds the title for the most durable cartel ever. I hope you're proud of that. I'm pretty sure that it's longer than any other cartel in modern history, okay? Extradition is very difficult, even though there is an extradition treaty between Japan and the United States. The Japan government does not cooperate. So one of the problems that antitrust authorities face when they prosecute cartels is you're not going to get full cooperation from the executives. They're going to go away, disappear, and your evidence is going to disappear also. The third major source of penalties is private recoveries. This is the amount of private recoveries per year in the United States. Canada also has an important program, but US and Canada stand alone in the world, pretty much, in having an active program of class actions that result in significant settlements at the end. As you can see, it's also an exponential function, and I have a prediction there for 2020. We'll see how that comes out. Now, severity is one of the ways you measure success, so to speak, in enforcement. As I mentioned, it's the penalties divided by the affected commerce involved. As you can see, there's one area of the world that's quite high, and that's the national competition authorities of EU obtain, on average, 30% of the affected commerce in fines. It's quite high, 30%. The rest of the world is pretty flat, you know, 12, 13, 14, 15%. Okay? There is a one other interesting thing you have to see here, and that is the private settlements are also 16%. So while the EU NCAs seem to be the highest, to really understand this, you have to add the 16% in the United States, plus the additional 16% that private parties are receiving. In other words, the average severity ratio in the United States is 32%, which makes it equal to or a little higher than the EU NCAs. The European Commission is rather low, and on average for the entire world, if you're interested, 21% is the world standard of severity ratios. Okay? A good standard for any antitrust authority to try to obtain. Now, of course, I can't get affected commerce on all cartels, but it's a very large sample, as you see, 662 cartels. A better ratio for trying to understand deterrence power is the recovery ratio, and that is the penalties divided by the overcharge. Now, this penalty ratio is related to the optimal penalty for cartels. Now, this I know is a little hard. This is the result of thinking that came out of the Chicago School, it's very logical. This is the simplest but pretty good version of it. What is the optimal penalty that you want to put on a firm or a group of firms in a cartel? It is, this theory concludes, the expected monopoly profits divided by the probability of prosecution. Okay? That's the ideal P star, the optimal penalty. It should not go above that, or you would have over-deterrence. It should not go below that number, or you would have under-deterrence. It should be precisely at this point. All right? Now notice this is expected monopoly profits because this is an ex-ante model. This is a model based on the decision to form a cartel, not run it, but to form it in the beginning. Okay? Well, there's a little sleight of hand here, but if we assume that the cartelists are pretty good at predicting what their profits are going to be, and I happen to believe that is the case, then you can change this a little bit and put actual damages in the numerator instead of expected monopoly profits, because they are the same, roughly. So you take actual damages and divide it by the probability of prosecution, and you have the ideal penalty to stop the formation of cartels. That's the ideal penalty, according to this theory of optimal deterrence. All right? Damages, there's some fine points. Damages should be adjusted for the time value of money, and because cartels last so long, and because the penalties take so long to be imposed, there should be prejudgment interest, and this is an issue that will excite lawyers, I'm sure, because prejudgment interest doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It's an interesting idea. There was one case that I was close to, the Finnish asphalt case, where prejudgment interest was awarded by the courts. In fact, they awarded punitive prejudgment interest, which is even wilder. But one of the problems with penalizing firms is that courts do not generally award interest prior to the judgment. Post-judgment interest is standard. I mean, every court seems to do that. But this prejudgment interest would make a huge difference if it were included. All right. Now let's go through an example of an optimal. How do you calculate these things? Well, you have to have a lot of information. First, what were the damages? I give the example of the lysine cartel because it's been particularly well documented. Damages in 2010 dollars were about $150 million worldwide. for the lysine cartel. They paid fines of a little over $100 million to the European Commission and to the U.S. Department of Justice. They made private settlements of a little under $100 million. And then, this is kind of an interesting thing, 3 of their executives were incarcerated for a long time. What's that worth? Professor Land and I came up with ways of estimating the opportunity cost of being in jail for a top-level executive, and it turns out that that was like worth about $50 million. Well, the optimal deterrence theory says, I don't care where the deterrence comes from, you lump them together. They need to be added together, and therefore we get total penalties of about 170 or $180 million, which is much greater than the damages. So this was a successful case, right? No, it wasn't. It wasn't, because now you have to figure out the optimal penalty for deterring this cartel, and it turns out that the optimal penalty, assuming a very conservative 30% detection rate, I believe it's 10 to 20, but very conservative, the optimal penalty was at least $500 million, which is double the actual penalties paid. And this is one of the outstanding examples of success worldwide of penalizing an international cartel. It's always cited by the Department of Justice as a great success. It is, but it isn't. You know, it's one of the better ones. It just doesn't quite get there. Okay. I often get from my friends who are representing defendants in cartel cases complaints, and they make them public sometimes at legal meetings. My client has been over-deterred. The amount of penalties that have been imposed, not only in the United States, but in Iceland and Europe and everywhere, you know, it's terrible to be, you know, my client is going to go out of business if he has to pay anymore, this company pays anymore. All right, let me say in advance, be skeptical of those claims, and for the following reasons. I think over-deterrence is often claimed, but rare, if ever. First of all, these are anecdotes from lawyers. Now, an anecdote is a sample of 1 or 2 or 3. For a social scientist, a sample of 1, 2, or 3 is not very satisfactory. We need 30 to 50 at a minimum, right? So it's an anecdote. And, you know, social scientists say anecdotes are no good because they're too small a sample. Another problem is that serial collusion is rampant. This is a study that I'll have coming out, I hope, this year. There are companies that have repeatedly colluded in international cartels, as many as 50 or 60 occasions worldwide. 50 or 60 repetitive violations of the law. Now, not all of those are recidivism as defined by because it has to be in the same jurisdiction and has to be exactly the same statute and it has to be more than 10 years or 20 years. So different jurisdictions have different rules, but a high share, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the serial collusion that goes on is in fact true recidivism, and it's generally being overlooked by competition authorities. The European Commission may be an exception. They have some pretty tough rules on that, but even they are pulling back on it. Prejudgment interest, I've already mentioned. It's rarely rewarded, and it ought to be. There is no compensation for deadweight losses. Deadweight losses are not identified with any particular purchasers, so there's no way under the law, but the companies that broke the law should have compensated the state or the market for messing it up. There's actually one state in the United States that allows it, the state of Mississippi. I worked for them one time, and they permit a judgment of relief to the state of Mississippi for undermining its markets, okay? So there is a deadweight loss concept there that I've never seen in any other jurisdiction. Be nice to have it. The biggest problem with the claims of overdeterrence is that the lawyers are looking backwards and assuming that 100% of all cartels are caught. It's just plainly wrong, okay? They don't take into consideration the probabilities of detection and conviction, okay, which I think are well under 30%. I think, last slide, what do we do about it? Well, here's some ideas. Global cartels, actually, these are widespread cartels that operated in several continents. They're the worst type of international cartel. They impose the greatest injuries. They have the highest affected commerce. They need a special attention. I would ask antitrust authorities to focus on them. But to do so requires joint multinational raids, because otherwise the evidence that's spread around the world will be destroyed. And those are difficult to pull off. In fact, there are only 1 or 2 or 3 a year. And that means getting together in advance and planning it, and within a few hours, worldwide, within a few hours, going to the offices all over the world of the defendants. That requires a great deal of military precision. Sharing of information across authorities is very helpful, particularly amnesty applications. That is permitted under the laws of some countries, and you can ask a waiver from the amnesty applicant to share it with other countries in many jurisdictions. That is a way of alerting other jurisdictions to the existence of an international cartel they weren't aware of. Okay. I think an important feature of fining is that it should be based on the jurisdiction's own sales, affected commerce, not global commerce, because then you don't have the problem of double jeopardy, which is particularly a problem in criminal law cases. And finally, the International Competition Network is a resource. The top administrators meet once a year and share information, but I think it's mainly the personal ties that are most important for that. So those are some policy suggestions and a few others I've dropped along the way. Thank you very much for your attention.